So these smaller banks, these smaller banks were basically fucking over the borrowers and packaging up the loans and selling them to companies like Chase and Goldman Sachs. Now, did the people at the top of those companies like Chase and Goldman Sachs necessarily know exactly what was going on all the way downstream?
Well, let me just ask you kind of a rhetorical question. I don't mean it to be a smartass, but I do want your honest answer. If you're good enough to pilot a multi-trillion-dollar, uh, you know, company, aren't you paid to do and know everything that's going on? Isn't that why you get paid the big bucks?
I would hope so.
So here's what you need to understand about control fraud. And that's what this whole thing is. And by the way, I know it's control fraud because I was taught by the master of control fraud who got 30,000 criminal referrals in the savings and loan crisis that led to over 1,000 convictions of high-level white-collar criminals in the savings and loan crisis. His name's William K. Black.
What is control fraud for people out there who
Control
don't know?
fraud, so people that are high executives, they want the sure thing, which is short term. They're incentivized through perverse incentives on the next quarter. It's all bonus structure. They need volume. They make their money on the volume of loans, not on the right loans, but on the volume of loans. So ultimately, it was predicated on getting bad loans. So did they know? Oh, yeah. How do I know that? Well, you're going to have to watch the series and see because we got it everywhere.
So,
like I said, who knew who did what, when, and how, and what they got away with? That's what we've got.
What was the main thing that happened next?
Well, we just get to the collapse. Season 2 is what happens after, and that's a whole nother ball of wax. So basically, really, like I think I may have mentioned this earlier, but the great financial crisis of 2008 was the third act of the savings and loan crisis, which happened in the early 90s. These are all financial frauds. Same with the Enron, same with what's going on. And it happens because we had the 3Ds that basically became policy: deregulation, desupervision, and decriminalization. What happens if you take the cops off the beat?
If you take the cops off what?
If you take the cops off the beat, what happens?
Shit just goes crazy and people just do whatever they want.
Criminals take over.
Right.
So all Mr. Law and Order people that are like, yeah, great in Portland and on Mark, you got the commander in chief, by the way, get a load of this. You know what, would it be safe to say you understand predatory lending through
absolutely.
But also through the vessel of Addie Polk, right? I mean, it's pretty clear she's a victim of predatory lending given the outcome.
Yeah.
Guess who else claimed to be a victim of predatory lending?
You're not going to say Donald Trump, are you?
I'm going to say Donald Trump. So he sued Deutsche Bank in 2012, the only bank in the world that would give him any loans, at being a victim of predatory lending, and he won. Or at least he was able to push it off until they got a settlement. But that's all in between everything else that's going on. Yes, Donald J. Trump was a victim of predatory lending.
On what? What was he? What was that? When was this?
2012.
2012.
Yeah, you want to look at a book that David Heinrich of the New York Times wrote. It's called Dark Towers. It's he was out on the circuit not long ago. This guy David Heinrich, because all the people, like particularly the MSNBCs of the world, wanted to interview him because it was off the heels of all the stuff that Trump's been involved with Russia and whatever else.
Yeah.
And so they wanted to connect him to Deutsche Bank. But when I read the book, I was like, wow. This guy Heinrich told the story that Deutsche Bank was the same player in the story that we're telling. And that was the big grift. So he spends 3/4 of the book telling the story that I just told you, but from the vantage of Deutsche Bank, because that's what Citibank was doing. That's what Chase is doing. That's what Goldman Sachs is doing. That's what Wells Fargo is doing, and Bank of America and Deutsche Bank, right? And so he goes in this thing, like 3/4 of the book, he reveals, and my jaw hit the floor. I literally fell out of the freaking chair when I was reading this, that Donald Trump sued Deutsche Bank for being a victim of predatory lending. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense.
Oh my God. That is fucking mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's dude, it's fucking same as it ever was, really. I mean, I'm reminded, like I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and there was this crazy cartoon, this animation called Heavy Metal. And you can see it online. There's this guy who goes to this intergalactic, it's like this total rock and roll fantasy tripper film. But there's this character who goes, and he's like this corrupt guy who's got this like patsy to, like, go into court and just lie on his behalf. And every time I see that, or I think about, like Trump and the way this system operates, the animators of heavy metal knew these kind of clowns back in the 70s. It's like one of the lines was, he sold dope disguised as a nun. And I'm thinking about all of these guys are just off the Richter, in terms of their immorality and their ability to deceive. And it's just insanity, man.
Yeah, it's the same thing with The Simpsons. They were able to predict a bunch of shit that's been happening.
Yes. Most notably The Simpsons. I've been paying attention to those guys for a long time.
So what's happening today? Do you see anything else happening or any sort of residual effects of that going on in the financial world today?
It's the same thing. So they double down, but they just turned it into commercial loans, and the commercial loan market crashed with all the same ingredients in September, and they papered it over with $7 trillion in repo loans from the Federal Reserve that nobody in media had a clue about because they were talking about Trump and Russia the whole time. Meanwhile, once again, the Ponzi scheme continues, and now we've got the CARES Act, and we've got all this stuff where literally 30 million people are predicted to be out of their homes and into the streets because of the rental crash. And by the way, a lot of these people are renting from the same financial institutions that picked up all of these properties on the cheap when they imploded or foreclosed in 2008. So it's the same system. It's just the next wave.
So I'm sorry, go back. You said September 2019 is what you were referring to? What specifically happened?
So you remember you asked me what was the trigger in 2008?
Yeah.
And I mentioned that it was repo overnight lending based on a run on the assets. And the reason they did that, because they shorted it, meaning the market makers, meaning the too big to fail banks that play both sides of the house. They are the casino. And they did the same thing in 2019. The only reason we don't know about it was because, twofold really. One, Dodd-Frank supposedly did the stress test with the banks, and that's a whole nother story. But the main reason was because they just kept quiet and nobody wanted to tell the story. And then we ended up with COVID and they papered it over. We've been living with this insanity for at least since 2019 in terms of the next exact wave.
Right. Yeah. And I know for a fact that this pandemic we're going through is completely destroying commercial real estate owners.
And that's where the big run was, because it's all commercial real estate that they replaced mortgage-backed securities with.
And you're saying a lot of these big banks still own some of this commercial real estate from 2008.
But what they're doing is they're able to take the so-called water cannon or the cannon from the Federal Reserve, and they're able to prop up their own bonds.
Right.
It's another part of asset fraud. It's asset bubbles, and they can play it every which way they do it. They've got control of the Fed. BlackRock is the administrator of the Fed. BlackRock is the operation that was there going back to the beginnings, which was during.
Explain to people who don't know what BlackRock is. A lot of people won't know.
BlackRock is a major financial consortium that's basically a hedge fund, and I think they're in private equity also. But they also manage pension funds, big pension funds, big institutional investors. And their job, like any hedge fund, is you make money. And a lot of those people make money on inside information, for one, Steven Schwartzman and so forth. And so they got pensions, where they're playing with their money that people earned over the course of 40 years, that they're getting returns. But they're getting returns on this market build of sawdust. Because let me ask you this, after the great financial crisis of 2008, when millions upon millions of people had no income and no jobs, who in the world was buying commercial real estate?
I don't fucking know. All I was doing was skateboarding in 2008.
Nice! By the way, skateboarders saved the world, man. I'm an old school skater, man.
Are you?
Yeah, I grew up in Dogtown era, man. I skate empty pools and run from the cops when I was a teenager.
Oh, hell yeah. That's all I did for pretty much the first 3/4 of my life so far.
I dig it, man, because skaters are always freaking wise, man. I'll tell you, skaters get hip to the game good, and skaters always on the right side of this stuff, man. Skaters are the good guys, and so.
Oh yeah, help for sure.
I know I'm being silly here, but I really believe that, because skaters have an attitude, because they got to dial a trick. It takes a lot of wiping out and consequence. Unlike Wall Street, when they wipe out, everybody else pays the price and they get to skate free.
Oh, they got a foam pit. They got a giant foam pit when they launch up the ramp they get to land in. Meanwhile, we're
surrounded by chicks and fucking in you know, cocktails, right? And everybody's trying to get in, it ain't happening.
And cocaine and hookers.
That's right. Oh, by the way, I will tell you this, reading of that. So going back to old school, right? I know everybody in the blogosphere talks a lot about Epstein and Weinstein and all these other things, but you know, back in the SNL crisis, what a lot of these banks would do is they'd have these huge parties, right? With you know, legislatures, elected officials, and they'd get them on camera, you know, doing fucking illicit drugs and screwing around with hookers, right? And so they had leverage over them. So
they blackmailed them?
Fuck yeah. This was going on decades, man. This is like old school freaking leverage, man. Yeah, and they still operate to that to this day, man. This is nasty business.
Holy shit.